Well, welcome to this webinar hosted by the 21st Century China Center at the School of Global Public Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego. GPS, the School of Global Public and Strategy, Policy and Strategy, offers several master's degree programs to students all over the world, and including one that focuses exclusively on the study of China, the Master's in Chinese Economics and Political Affairs, MCEAP, EPA in short. So I'm Richard Madsen, professor of sociology at UCSD, and I'm also director of the Fudan UC Center in Contemporary China. I specialize in Chinese religion, civil society, culture, and so forth. I've actually authored 17 books on various aspects of Chinese culture, Chinese and civil society, and US-China relations. Today, we're going to discuss a new book on Chinese soft power, which examines China's complex and often contradictory soft power performance around the world. This is a topic that is increasingly central to public attention these days and public concern, and we're looking very much forward to hearing from our speaker. Our speaker and author is Maria Repnikova, and this is based on her new book on media politics in China. Maria is an expert on Chinese political communication. She's an associate professor of global communication at Georgia State University. She has a doctorate from Oxford University, where she was also a Rhodes Scholar, and she's been a visiting fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center, the Annenberg School at the University of Pennsylvania, and many other important centers for reflection and thought. She's also written on, her first book was on media politics in China. This is sort of a follow-up and also maybe a transition to a study she's doing on Chinese soft power and influence in Africa, or lack thereof. We're looking very much forward for hearing from her. This whole notion of soft power in China is a broader, in some ways more multifaceted, nuanced concept than the one we're used to hearing about in the context of what Joe Nye introduced 2 decades ago. And I'm looking forward to a really dynamic question and answer period. When you ask questions, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I'll sort them out and then present them to Maria, and looking forward to hearing you very much, Maria. So please go ahead.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Professor Madsen. It's a real pleasure to be part of the speaker series, and I only wish it was in person, but it's still a delight to participate in this discussion. I really look forward to your comments, and it's so hard to keep up with you, such an inspiration with 17 books. It's really an incredible amount of knowledge and expertise that you're sharing with all of us. So thank you for all your continuous work. I'm going to share my screen. So this is the, let's see, I'm just going to put it into the, there we go. Okay, so everybody can see my screen? Hope, yeah. Great. So today's talk is going to examine and engage with this idea of soft power from the China's perspective. It's a new book. It's a shorter book. It's part of Cambridge University Press Element series. That's meant to be kind of a hybrid between an article and a book format, and it's part of a Global China series that's edited by Professor Qingquan Li from UCLA. So there are a number of other books that follow this one that examine with different facets of China's increasingly global presence. So in this book, I engage with the several themes that I'm going to present to you today in this discussion. So first of all, the distinctive interpretations and practices of Chinese soft power, and then the performance of major Chinese public diplomacy initiatives. Specifically, in my book, I examine 4 different initiatives, ranging from Confucius Institutes to Chinese media, so increasing expansion of China's state media presence globally, as well as China's internationalization of its higher education, so the presence of many international students in China and how that plays into China's public diplomacy and in some ways also limits Chinese soft power. And lastly, major public diplomacy spectacles like the Olympic Games, but also trade fairs and other major diplomatic events hosted in part by the Chinese government. So the second part of this discussion and talk will engage with the performance of these initiatives and to what extent do we know about their success versus challenges. And rather than taking kind of a binary view of success or failure, I'm trying to examine both the adaptation of these initiatives, to what extent they've shifted or transformed over time, what are the unique characteristics of Chinese public diplomacy, as well as what are the key limitations, how are they limited in what capacity, and how does their performance vary across regions, as well as across different diplomatic instruments. And lastly, I'll conclude with some gaps in our understanding of soft power, Chinese soft power, what remains to be studied and in what form. So starting with the key findings, the key arguments in this book. So the first one is, the first argument I make is that in Chinese context, the interpretation of soft power, as Professor Matz already alluded to, is much more expansive than the way it's been envisioned and presented by Joseph Nye over 2 decades ago. So specifically, soft power is understood in China as a much more fluid idea and practice. And I'm going to discuss what that fluidity really means. And secondly, I engage with these initiatives, specifically with diplomatic initiatives, as both contradictory and very much varied across different spaces. So I see them as both ambitious, in particular when it comes to localization of public diplomacy or adjustment to different local contexts, but also highly contested. And this contestation varies from legitimacy crises or gaps in legitimacy credibility, but also operational challenges, frictions in kind of racial misinterpretation, and challenges when it comes to students from Africa and many other dimensions of limitations. And then I also engage with the variation across contexts, especially global South versus the West, or global North. So very briefly, I'm sure many of you in the audience are familiar with the concept of soft power, the original concept that was coined by Joseph Nye, and in many ways was meant to kind of reclaim or re-engage the US power in the international system through this untapped resource of attraction or soft power, the notion of attraction or power that goes beyond coercive or cooperative power, engaging with foreign policy, values, and culture, American culture, and kind of reestablishing the US presence in the international order. And of course, Nye has written widely about this concept after 1990 as well, post 9/11 and the Iraq War. He reasserted the importance of soft power as a form of reputation management of the United States in the Middle East. In 2003, he also coined the concept of smart power, combining soft and hard power. So this concept has been widely, critiqued and engaged with by IR scholars, in some ways critiqued as being too broad, maybe too vague, and in some ways also as quite US-centric. But this broadness of this concept has also been one of the reasons why it's been so widely re-engaged or reappropriated by many other powers beyond the United States. Many of them are contenders in some ways of the US and the international system, including Turkey, Iran, Russia, and of course, China. And in my view, China has been one of the most enthusiastic kind of adopters of this idea of soft power. We see concepts like Chinese cultural soft power, Wenhua Ruanshili, discourse power, Huayuquan, big country image, Daguo Xinxiang, coming out over the past 2 decades. Starting in mid-2000s, we see a particular pickup of this concept of soft power, and again, reinterpreted and translated into different sub-concepts that I've introduced just now. Thousands of academic articles in Chinese have come out on this topic that I've reviewed for this book, selectively, of course, not all of them, but the selective themes. And we also see an increasing spending on public diplomacy. So this spending is very difficult to be precise about because there's so many institutions involved in soft power production, and not all of them have publicly available data. But according to The Economist, the estimate is around $10 billion a year, which compares to about 2.19 billion spent by the United States. So there's quite a bit of outspending, at least based on these estimates. So when it comes to the adaptation or reappropriation of this concept of soft power, as I mentioned earlier, there's a much more fluid understanding of soft power in the Chinese conception, even more fluid than what was originally proposed by Nye. And specifically, I see this fluidity in 2 forms. First, there is a deliberate fusion of hard and soft power resources and image-making campaigns in China. And second, we see the targets of soft power in China is very much both domestic and external. And I'm going to discuss this now in more detail. So when it comes to conceptualizing, soft power, we see, again, Nye defining it through three different resources: culture, values, and foreign policy. But when it comes to Chinese conceptualization of soft power, there's a big debate about, what counts as soft power, right, in China, what resources amount to soft power. And there's quite explicit critique about this notion that hard and soft power should be seen as separate, separate instruments. In fact, many writers in Chinese journals argue that US soft power very much builds on its hard power presence, whether it's military power or economic power. In China, China should be doing the same. And when they talk about the resources, they emphasize culture, but culture in a very amorphous kind of form. It could be interpreted as ideology, as Chinese history, but also, they emphasize the idea of political mobilization, China's successful economic governance, its technological prowess, and many other instruments as counting as soft power. So basically anything that seems to improve or contribute to China's image being understood as part of China's soft power arsenal. So many different instruments are often listed in this article. It's not a very precise idea, but oftentimes in practice, we see a fusion of material and cultural power. That's something that I observe, in analyzing various instruments in this book, but also in my larger project on Chinese soft power in Africa, where I've done a lot of empirical work in Ethiopia, drawing on some of these examples as well. We see that material and cultural power are often inseparable. It's very hard to kind of delink the two. So giving you just a few examples here, when we see diplomatic spectacles taking place in China in particular, I'm thinking about trade fairs, there's often a very pertinent presence of the economic dimension. It's either centered around economic exchange or economic exchange as part of larger cultural exchange. One of the events that takes place annually that I've attended in Ethiopia was a trade fair between actually Hunan province and Ethiopia. And we see the presentation of, Hunan officials very much focusing on Hunan's cultural resources and what Hunan has accomplished, kind of a soft power public diplomacy presentation, but also focusing, of course, on what it has to offer in terms of economic resources, trade, investments to Ethiopia. So the economic and cultural dimensions are often intermixed. When we look at higher education marketing, Chinese higher education, university marketing, the promotion often focuses on low fees and large-scale scholarships, especially to students from Global South. At the moment, at least the latest data suggests that there are about 80,000 African students, studying in China, about half, the number of the United States. US houses about 40,000 students from Africa, but the emphasis is on the fact that it's accessible, right? It's low fee, or you can get funding through various scholarship schemes sponsored by the government. When it comes to Confucius Institutes as well, we see that especially in the Global South, there's a real emphasis on job allocation and scholarships as well as cultural exchange. So this is a brief illustration of that. It's a very crowded slide, but this is something that I've come across as an advert for why one should study Chinese that was posted in the north of Ethiopia at Mekelle University that I visited. And when you look at the benefits of learning Chinese language here at the bottom of this advert, you see that most of the benefits, the top 4, are very practical. Study Chinese with a scholarship. So, go to China and see China for free, join a summer camp or visit China, work in a Chinese company with high payments, trade with Chinese international companies, or be an officer or Chinese language teacher. Experiencing or enjoying Chinese culture comes as F. So basically number 5 reason of studying Chinese. So very pragmatic reasons given to why one should sign up for Confucius Institutes. And from my research in the field, I also found that it's primarily job allocation that attracts students to Confucius Institutes in Ethiopia and in many other African countries. Maybe that's unique to Global South, but maybe that's something that China will also expand on, engaging in this kind of material way in other contexts as well. And China's storytelling through state media, if you analyze the content and look at Chinese media coverage, you see that a lot of it emphasizes on China's economic success story, as opposed to kind of hard ideological, propaganda. We see a lot of stories about what China has accomplished in various economic domains. And that's a similar trend to what I've been analyzing when it comes to training materials. Chinese state has been engaged in training elites from the Global South. And when I was analyzing these materials, these PowerPoint presentations, the focus is very much on the economic success story, much less so on the kind of cultural story or political story of China. And of course, just a very brief image of this is a kind of another tangent of, I would argue, still belongs in the story of soft power. It's just hard infrastructure building, but infrastructure that's meant for public use and oftentimes being granted either for free or at a very low cost loan. This is an infrastructure building here on the right. You see construction of a stadium in Ethiopia, and we see this kind of public infrastructure being built all around, various African capitals. And this signage, kind of the post all around this construction, is also very much suggesting or very explicit about the fact that it's Chinese companies that are building this, not another country's kind of firm. So very clear about promoting their branding alongside with their infrastructure. So the second kind of key, I think, distinction when it comes to Chinese soft power, both vision and practice, is the notion of dual publics. So we see that the target of soft power initiatives is both towards external publics and towards domestic publics. And I think that's quite different from the way that Nye has envisioned this in the context of the United States. It's very much about shifting global public opinion, external public opinion, or US reputation management in various conflict zones. Here we see that the public is dual. So on the one hand, the external publics matter, and in Chinese discourses and soft power, there's a very strong emphasis on discourse power and the idea that China as a power, as a nation, does not have enough space to speak in the international system, so to speak, does not have enough of a voice, because that voice tends to be taken over by the West. In particular, the US is blamed for discursive hegemony. And China has to work harder to be able to kind of prove itself and also to soften its economic rise. The idea that without soft power, China cannot achieve the full rise in the international system. But at the same time, there's a strong emphasis on domestic publics in Chinese soft power discussions and writings, in particular terms like cultural confidence and cultural security. I found quite striking in much of the analysis of soft power in Chinese journals and policy articles. And here the idea is that by making China perhaps seen as more prominent or admired or respected internationally, Chinese domestic public would also find this idea that, of China's success much more believable, or this might legitimate Chinese Communist Party's performance in the eyes of domestic public, but also to perhaps shield the public from the so-called infiltration of Western culture, which is something that's been talked about a lot under C, this idea of protecting or buffering Chinese public from the infusion of Western cultural, again, capital, textbooks, anything that comes from the West is seen as much more sensitive, I think, in the past several years, or maybe even longer under Xi Jinping. So the idea of domestic publics really, I think, is very important in the context of Chinese soft power. And when we see the practices of Chinese soft power, there's also this prominent appeal to kind of dual publics. And here are some examples of that. When we think about China's diplomatic spectacles, including the Olympic Games, in 2008, we saw quite a bit of writing coming out on the Olympic Games being kind of a civilizing campaign for Chinese publics, all kinds of educational campaigns aimed at revitalizing or civilizing Chinese domestic publics, whether it's about speaking English or behaving in certain ways in public. There was quite a bit of target, catered towards domestic audiences. In this latest Olympic Games, most of the audience was domestic and very local because of the pandemic as well. But in other spectacles, such as the trade fair that I've attended, the major China-Africa trade fair, the first of its kind that took place in Hunan province pre-pandemic, most of the audience was coming from Changsha, from Hunan, directly from the city. But also if you attend and look around the exhibits, you see that a lot of the actual exhibition, kind of stalls are more aimed towards domestic audiences. For instance, there are many provincial exhibits taking place, advertising the success stories of individual specific provinces. And most of the attendees of those provincial booths were also Chinese. So it's kind of like a soft power mirage, for domestic publics, as opposed to kind of more directly targeting African audiences, which were also attending this fair. When we look at the social media side of the story, Chinese media presence on Twitter, for instance, but also Chinese diplomats, in particular, the style that is now currently referred to as wolf warrior diplomacy. I think much of this communication is also very much catered towards nationalistic sentiment domestically, as opposed to co-opting or enticing, external publics. This is just some examples from very recent posts by Hua Chungyin, who is one of the spokespeople for the foreign ministry, very active on Twitter. And these particular points are about the war in Ukraine, very much anti-NATO, anti-US sentiment here, but kind of instead of engaging with the war in Ukraine directly, it's about blaming the US, its own wars that have been unaccounted for, the various casualties they've caused. And then the last phrase, the conviction that the US is always right, is in itself a big and pathetic mistake. Policies without reflection and deliberation cannot be right. To me, this kind of statements are really catering towards domestic publics. There's no way they're possibly, seen as positive or engaging for Western publics or American audiences. And we see much of this wolf warrior style diplomacy, I think, very much oriented internally. Of course, not all Chinese diplomats are practicing it, but I think there's a growing number. And I've also observed in other projects how this is happening also in Chinese digital diplomacy in Africa, where US is often invoked or engaged with in these very contentious ways. And the third example here is about Confucius Institutes and the kind of this cultural exchange. On the one hand, it's about, of course, engaging external audiences. On the other hand, it's about internationalizing Chinese teachers and volunteers, as well as boosting domestic confidence about the attractiveness of Chinese culture. So when I was interviewing a lot of these Chinese teachers and volunteers working in Ethiopia, I found that for them, most of the rationale for coming to Ethiopia was about getting experience in teaching English, teaching in English, but also teaching Chinese as a second language, basically getting more professional credentials and internationalizing their work experience. That's one of the primary reasons for them to do this job, as opposed to promoting Chinese culture per se. Very kind of internal and pragmatic rationale here, which also speaks to material benefits or material exchange. But also the idea of showcasing kind of this notion of foreigners learning Chinese for domestic audiences through various television programs. I'm sure some of you have watched some of the shows where foreigners are speaking Chinese, and impressing Chinese audiences with their eagerness to understand Chinese culture. That's a very popular kind of TV production for domestic audiences. So shifting towards briefly unpacking some of these soft power performances, to what extent it's doing well and how well it's doing, I want to just first talk about adaptation and localization, kind of some of the impressive ways in which Chinese soft power initiatives have been localizing or trying to adjust to local audiences, and then briefly note about the challenges. So when it comes to localization, we see this in across public diplomacy spectrum, and maybe it's not that surprising because it's also being directed from the top. A lot of these initiatives, when you look at their official narratives or official directives, it's all about localization. So when you look at Confucius Institutes, I already mentioned the engagement with a local context by offering very specific contextual kind of benefits. And I think this is very important to note that what Confucius schools are offering in Ethiopia is not the same thing that perhaps they're offering in Europe or in the United States. When you look at the United States, the adjustment is more about kind of programming is about culture. Chinese, language learning is a CV booster, but not so much a very direct way of getting a job with Chinese companies. So they adjust how they market the language, how they market the cultural exchange, depending on the context they're engaging with. That's something I also gathered from my interviews. When we look at Chinese media, state media, we see an active recruitment of local journalists and translators. If you visit a major bureau, whether it's CGTN bureau in Washington or in Nairobi, you'll find that most of the employees are coming from these respective countries, right? Whether it's Kenya or Washington or other global contexts, but not necessarily Chinese journalists. And I think the idea here is very much to tell the story through this local lens. Let the foreigners again kind of tell the story. And here the material and localization benefits or facets kind of intertwine, because these journalists oftentimes, especially in Nairobi, take these jobs because they're more secure, they're often more long-term, they provide longer-term contracts than, say, Western media outlets. So it's kind of a pragmatic rationale for joining this kind of outlets, but also they're promised to be able to tell their stories from a different perspective, as opposed to Western media often focusing on disasters or crises. Chinese media is promising what they describe as constructive journalism, telling a more positive or more interesting story about development, hope, and so forth. But as I'll get to in a moment, this constructive journalism often turns into more propagandistic or overly positive storytelling that's not that effective engaging public audiences' response or in getting them interested. We see in terms of localization also Chinese universities actively recruiting international students. I've observed this also in practice with Chinese faculty sending representatives to various countries. In my context, it was Ethiopia, and directing through Confucius Institutes various recruiting kind of missions and programs to get more international students on board. Why are they so actively recruiting them? I think in part it's because many of the students come basically paying their own fees, their own dues. So it's good for the budgeting, but also they often get more grants from the government if they have a more international status. They try to recruit and become seen as a more internationally oriented universities or institutions. We also see provincial diplomacy as I think really escalating, and we see a lot of provincial governments engaging in their own diplomatic kind of programming and policies outside of Beijing, or maybe kind of parallel to what Beijing is doing, but not necessarily directly directed by them or by central government. So as I've already mentioned earlier, I've seen this happening, especially when it comes to Hunan government vis-a-vis Ethiopia, and other scholars have noticed similar initiatives from other provinces. I think that's something really interesting to examine, provincial diplomacy, how it's managed and how maybe it diverges across different provinces. Unfortunately, due to fieldwork restrictions, it's a bit tough to study this in China at the moment. So shifting for the last part of the talk towards performance challenges. So we see this adaptation, localization as maybe somewhat of a hopeful sign of how Chinese soft power is performing. But when we look at the challenges, it's kind of a bit of a different story. So there are 4 challenges that I wanted to briefly mention that I also analyze in my book. One is the challenge of credibility. The second is the frictions between material and cultural enticement. The third is operational challenges. And lastly is cultural and racialized frictions. So when it comes to credibility challenges, I think that's the most familiar, I think, to most of the audiences tuning into this talk, the idea that Chinese soft power, because it's being pushed through the state, sponsored by the party state, is being seen as a propaganda initiative. And of course, in Washington policy circles, it's often being described as sharp power, information, influence operations, and so forth. Sometimes soft power is being ignored altogether as a concept to discuss public diplomacy operated or funded by Chinese government. So that's part of kind of a pre-existing conception of just what Chinese diplomacy really is about, is because it is associated with party state. It has limited credibility gap here. And we also see the increasing importance of China's economy as facilitating more questioning of the intentions behind China's soft power. So I've observed this, again, in my fieldwork with larger book project, that a lot of this increasing kind of growing presence of China economically, say in Ethiopia, also gives rise to many questions, concerns, critiques, and anxieties about China's presence. Because of course, the economic presence comes with Chinese labor and Chinese infrastructure comes with loans. So there are lots of anxieties about, if Chinese soft power or public diplomacy is happening on the ground, is it because of some kind of, again, cooperative propaganda function of making people believe or get a softer kind of take a softer gaze on Chinese economic activities and not criticize it so much. So that's something that I've come across quite a bit in my research. The second friction that I discuss here is the challenge of material attraction, right? Because so much of this soft power performance, especially in the global south, is tied to what China offers materially. It comes with its own limitations. I think, first of all, it's very much contingent upon China's increasing economic presence and material offerings. So if China is not offering as much, perhaps the soft power engagement wouldn't be that effective. And a briefing about that from the study, about Confucius Institutes that just came out in China Quarterly. is that, when I interviewed deans of universities across Ethiopia about Confucius Institutes and asked them what would happen if Chinese companies would no longer need basically, Ethiopians who speak Chinese as a kind of a form of labor, as translators, what would happen if there were no jobs for Chinese speakers? They responded very swiftly that, we would shut down the institutes. So as long as there are jobs, they're happy to engage in this cultural exchange. But if there are no jobs, if there's no pragmatic kind of rationale for engagement, they're not that excited about hosting these institutes on campus or in engaging in this cultural, exchange. Part of it is also due to the fact that the encounters themselves, cultural encounters, such as the ones through Confucius Institutes, are quite limited. A lot of the teachers live isolated kind of lifestyles. They don't engage very much with local communities or local society. And they do focus on their advertising, again, via kind of pragmatic means, jobs, scholarships, as opposed to Chinese culture per se, beyond Chinese traditional culture, which excites some students, but maybe not quite the large proportion of the participants. So over time, I think it's the problem of rising expectations and continuing to provide for this opportunistic kind of engagements. And if there's no opportunities, if there's no material benefits, perhaps soft power itself would wane or withdraw over time. The third one is operational challenges. Despite the fact that there is increasing emphasis on localizing content and localizing engagement across, in accordance to various contexts, we also see frictions in localization processes. For instance, when it comes to media and newsrooms, there have been studies recently published about the fact that these newsrooms are still quite hierarchical. So one can be hired as a journalist, but not as an editor. So one still has to serve the interest of the editors who are mainly Chinese, and there isn't quite that much of a unity or shared culture when it comes to these various localizing initiatives. There's also the issue with superficial performance evaluation matrix when it comes to soft power. That may not be unique to China, but it's important to mention that most of the evaluation is about scale. So how many events were taking place? How many students signed up for Chinese language classes? How many attendees, came to the trade fair? But not so much about the evaluation of the actual exchange or the shift in perceptions of China. Did this particular event shift how one sees China? Was there productive exchange and learning? Those kind of softer measures are not being considered in soft power evaluation, which makes it difficult to really understand to what extent soft power is really shifting perceptions of China. And lastly, there's a challenge of dual audience, right? I already mentioned that wolf warrior diplomacy, for instance, is oriented towards domestic and external publics. But as a result of focusing so much on domestic publics, especially with these assertive narratives, I think Chinese public diplomacy often loses out on international audiences, or this diplomacy is being seen as very kind of aggressive and not very attractive, and that's something that's very hard to shift without reorienting one's diplomacy, largely towards external audiences as opposed to nationalistic publics back home. And very final point about cultural and racial frictions, that's something I examined specifically in the context of Africa, but we've seen quite a number of frictions reveal themselves through these various crises of the pandemic. Of course, we remember this incident, a large-scale incident in Guangzhou, where many African residents were pushed out of their homes as a result of the pandemic fears and so forth. And this was a big public relations scandal, but it also gave rise to many discussions about racial discrimination and lack of racial awareness across Chinese society. And crisis has been kind of shuffled to the sidelines now, but there is no real reckoning with the notion of race, racism, and racial frictions when it comes to hosting students of color or visitors of color to China. I think that's something that's going to persist as a potential area of contestation in the future, because I don't see this conversation happening or publicly anytime soon. And there are several points on variation receptions. I mentioned that there's a contested kind of a implementation or performance of Chinese soft power, but it also varies across different contexts. So even though we know quite little actually about reception in terms of numbers, we rely mainly on public opinion polls. When it comes to public opinion polls, we do see more favorability of China in the global South, especially in the African context, but also in other global South contexts like Latin America. There's just a higher kind of a favorability when it comes to how China is being perceived, as opposed to global North or the West, where the rankings are basically going down for years now. But at the same time, this performance is still very, very contested, right? It depends on who is being polled, how the questions are framed, but also there's a big gap between elites and the publics. Elites might be more prone to engaging with China, whereas the public is more suspicious or concerned with low dependency, low quality goods coming from China, and the presence of Chinese workers on the ground. So there's not quite a uniform kind of a reception there. But arguably, we also see some variation across different instruments. For example, when it comes to experiential initiatives like education exchanges, trainings, and spectacles, performances, when one actually gets to visit China and see China for what it has accomplished, or the limited kind of exposure that they get to see is what China has accomplished over the past several decades, there seems to be at least some sense of affective connection or emotional connection to China, whereas the kind of more indirect mechanisms like through education in other countries or through the media especially seems to be less effective. All the public opinion surveys we have on the media suggest that there's quite a bit of suspicion towards Chinese state media across contexts, whether it's global South or the West. And the very final point to conclude on is the areas for further research. I think what we need to research more or engage with more is studying China's soft power and public diplomacy in a comparative context. And in terms of comparison, I think it's important to look at both maybe comparative kind of large authoritarian states like Russia, but also major democracies, contenders for discourse power, such as the United States. In my brief analysis, I include this a bit in the book, but also in other projects, I see Russia's engagement externally, diplomatically, especially through the media, what I describe as kind of destructive soft power. It's about disrupting the West, disrupting the Western liberal order, as opposed to the more constructive soft power on the Chinese side, despite the wolf warrior diplomacy, an attempt to tell a China story, which we don't quite see happening from the Russian side. On the US side, we see much more explicit ideological competition, in particular, often framing the world order as democracies versus autocracies, or the US as being the morally righteous power. And in China, often a much more pragmatic engagements by offering material goods and services as part of its cultural engagement around the world. These are just very simplified comparisons, but just to encourage more comparative, I think, research to understand what's distinctive about China and what is maybe more generalizable or applies to other contexts. And lastly, I think we need to explore new instruments of Chinese soft power in more empirical detail. Some of these instruments I see as somewhat understudied is the role of Chinese diasporic communities. We see them studied separately, but in the context of soft power, it would be very interesting to see to what extent Chinese diasporic communities are channeling, the CCP voices, especially through the media, and to what extent they might be challenging China's soft power initiatives. And there's some work coming out of that now, but it's still, I think, a very under-researched arena and a really exciting one. The other element is the role of communication infrastructure. So platforms like TikTok, but also China's engagement in, building telecom infrastructure or providing digital TV access in Africa through the company called StarTimes. These sort of initiatives are supposed to be mostly about technology, but they also carry ideational components. For instance, Huawei, alongside with providing technology, also has many academies that train engineers and offer kind of training opportunities and engagements with China beyond just the technology. Digital TV infrastructure provides access to digital TV at a very low cost, but also includes soap operas and content coming from China. So the kind of ideational components that I think also parallel the technological side of engagement, that is a really interesting part of this research. And of course, TikTok, a Chinese company, very prominent on the global scale, something that is maybe perhaps the more successful example of China's technological kind of soft power. And lastly, the role of Chinese companies, I think especially private enterprises in inhibiting, but also in potentially promoting China's image. When it comes to, official perceptions about Chinese soft power coming from China, through my interviews, Chinese officials and scholars often blame private companies as hurting China's image. So if everything was done according to plan, we wouldn't have any kind of image problems or frictions on the ground, but Chinese companies don't respect local communities or local kind of norms, and they disrupt China's image. It's interesting kind of tension there between the private and the public or state side. And I think that tension could be explored further and through empirical research. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to Professor Madsen's questions and comments and any questions from the audience. Thank you.
Good. Well, thank you very, very much, Maria. Let me gather up some questions, and I'm looking forward to a really good discussion. Maybe to begin with, though, let me start off by asking some questions of my own. First of all, to what extent is the Chinese state able and willing to coordinate its soft power message in a way that may be less possible here? So here you have all sorts of, American companies, individuals, and so forth, independent actors around the world. Some give a good impression of America, some don't. And there's really no way for the government to control that. But in China, are there elements of the state party that can exert more control? For example, the propaganda department, the United Front Department, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and for that matter, Chinese academia. What role do they play in actually kind of constructing or, projecting independent message? And then maybe one final question is, to what extent does this approach, you already, talked about this at the end, but maybe say a little more about how is it working? So the Pew survey that came out today said that in USA, 80% of the American population has a somewhat negative view of China, okay? So that's a case where the soft power, is going in, from the Chinese point of view, in the wrong direction, even in real recent times. So what kind of global events influence the direction in which this is heading from the point of view of China.
Thank you so much. Should I respond to your comments?
Sure, go ahead, and I'll be sorting out some other questions now.
So thank you so much for these two very interesting and challenging questions. So the first one was about the extent of coordination or the ability to present a more coherent, relatively coherent, I guess, image of China through its soft power versus, say, the United States, that's much more decentralized and difficult for the state, if not impossible, to impose a particular vision. I think there's a degree of coordination, but also quite a significant degree of decentralization or fragmentation when it comes to China's image production or enforcement overseas. So I think when it comes to coordination, there is a significant role that the propaganda department plays, but also that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and plays, and other official bodies like United Front in kind of coordinating and imposing, a certain type of storytelling about China. That story is mostly a positive story. As I mentioned, it's about China's economic accomplishments, but also in no way does it include a story of, in very limited way, story of challenges or weaknesses or struggles that China is going through. If those struggles are included, it tends to be presented as China overcoming those struggles. I think we've seen this a little bit in terms of the effectiveness of that coordination in the aftermath of the Wuhan lockdown and kind of China emerging as this COVID kind of a superpower guiding other countries in COVID response, supplying, selling or providing PPE kind of equipment and so forth, basically emerging as a savior of the pandemic as opposed to the instigator. And in that sense, we did see quite a bit of coordination across diplomatic communication, media, all forms of kind of soft power diplomacy were pretty much in line with the same message that China is there to help the world battle in the pandemic. And I think that was maybe done somewhat effectively, except now we're seeing a story of China's zero COVID policy is backfiring, and perhaps that image has somewhat stalled or been reversed to some extent when it comes to global perceptions of how well China is managing. But I think that was a good example of coordination. But I think at the same time, we do see a degree of decentralization. I think what I've observed, in particular, maybe the Ukraine war is an interesting example because it's happening right now, and many of us are watching these developments. But if you look at the messaging of this war, so there's several points of fragmentation. So first of all, we see fragmentation between, say, global outlets like CGTN and some of the diplomatic communication, like the foreign ministry spokespeople tend to come out as much more nationalistic, anti-NATO, anti-US, whereas the CGTN coverage actually has involved quite a bit of reporting from Ukraine, so showcasing the horrendous, crimes against humanity committed by the Russian army, at least to some extent showcasing Ukrainian side, as opposed to only treating this as kind of a proxy war between the US and Russia. So I thought that kind of distinction was interesting. Again, domestic media hardly reports on the war. Chinese state media externally seems to present a more balanced perspective, like CGTN, but also in diplomatic communication, we see the Chinese ambassador to the UN as taking a much more kind of middle ground position, trying to strike this diplomatic balance versus foreign ministry spokespeople much more nationalistic wolf warrior style. So we see some kind of, fractures even in this particular war context, which is a very sensitive topic. So it's a little bit surprising to see the distinctions that we're observing. Part of it could be the appeal of this kind of wolf warrior narrative because of the potential promotion, kind of possibilities, or appearing as more patriotic, nationalistic, as maybe yielding a better position in the future, kind of bureaucratic rationale. Part of it could be the appeal to domestic public opinion. Nationalistic sentiments have been very strong, overpowering on Chinese social media with regards to this war. So there could be many reasons for why, we see some of these distinctions, but I don't think that the messaging is completely coherent, nor is it completely centralized. So I think that's interesting. And the other part on decentralization that I found fascinating during my last fieldwork, which feels like very long ago, but 2019 in Beijing, when I was visiting and talking to certain party schools that train elites coming from the global south. Even one academy, a particular academy, one might not have connections with another one, say based in Shanghai. One in Beijing has no connection. So a lot of kind of fractured relationships or engagements. Or if you ask them, how do you think the Confucius Institutes are doing? Hanban, the previous kind of institution overseeing Confucius Institutes, they have no connection to Hanban. So they only do the work that they're allocated to do, which is training elites and performing kind of these lectures and tours. They have no context or understanding or deep engagement with other institutions that are working on soft power. So even though there's so much kind of soft power, supposed coordination of soft power activities, when we look on the ground, we see a lot of kind of decentralized work and lack of communication across different bureaucracies. So that's just another side point or side note that something I was learning about during my last trip to China. And the second question about how is it working, and you brought up Pew Public Opinion Survey of the US, most people having a negative perception of China. So I think we definitely see a big divergence here between the West, in particular the US, but also arguably also Europe and other Western liberal democracies and the global South. So in this context, yes, the public opinion rankings of of favorability of China are going down significantly, have gone down. And even after the Olympics, in 2008 Olympics, which was supposedly this win, kind of soft power win victory for China, the rates or the ranking still went down in the West. So it's interesting how even that kind of backfired. So it seems that in the West, soft power engagements are not working that effectively. And maybe that's also why some diplomats have turned towards wolf warrior diplomacy, because that maybe is another tactic to at least speak to domestic public opinion, if not to publics in the global South. But I do think that in the context of global South, which sometimes gets ignored in this analysis, there is more favorability and there's more potential for China's success, maybe not necessarily full-hearted success, but at least an interest of the public to engage with what China is offering. I think that's a big distinction with the West, but that's a brief answer, but thank you so much for those questions.
Well, thank you so much. Okay, we have lots of questions. We have 16 altogether, which there's no way to get through these in the next few minutes, but I'll try to kind of pick and choose, but also kind of summarize, a bunch of them. So one of the first ones had to do with, could Maria comment on the role of cinema in Chinese soft power, domestically and abroad? This is from Alan Epstein.
So I haven't studied cinema very closely, but overall, if you look at kind of the instruments of soft power, I don't think cinema or Chinese soap operas have done quite that well when it comes to engaging global audiences. But I'm seeing a little bit of a shift. I've been looking at a few, not so much studies, but some anecdotal evidence from some graduate students even arguing that they're watching a lot of Chinese soap operas. They're coming up for free on YouTube, and there's a lot of engagement from the public that's non-Chinese, a lot of comments in English, and maybe some of this content is becoming more popularized. But up until now, I think the consensus has been that Chinese cinema hasn't been quite as effective, in part because of censorship and the lack of creative space to, again, come up with these more complex stories. A lot of the stories that we're seeing are more patriotic films. Wolf Warrior is one, great example. That's the film about Chinese kind of military and army units saving Africans in this crisis moment and so forth. It's very patriotic. It can be quite engaging, but it's not really a complex story of China. And sometimes, again, it's seen as either too positive, too pro-China, and too subdued when it comes to critique. So that's been a big issue. And I think also under Xi Jinping, we've seen a big crackdown on the entertainment industry. When it comes to censorship, there's a big targeting of entertainment figures, not only journalists. So that also makes it much harder to, again, come up with this kind of creative content. There's a big shift or distinction, rather, to be made here between K-pop, for instance, Korean, pop culture, including cinematic and soap opera kind of productions, and China, where you see in Korea, there's a big kind of allowance or even directives for bottom-up culture production. So, as long as the successful product is being produced, it's fine. Whoever is producing it is being encouraged to do so. And then K-pop labels kind of being put on those products for exporting sort of Korean soft power. But in the context of China, we see a lot more top-down kind of soft power production, and bottom-up voices are encouraged to some extent only if they speak to the tune, again, of the party and don't go too much outside that scope of desensitized kind of content. So I think it's very difficult, again, in terms of the creative space. And I think that space has shrunk, unfortunately, in the past 6-7 years. Thank you for that question.
Do you think in the long run, the kind of creativity that comes from top down and involves, creative criticism of one's country is more effective actually in the long run in actually creating a positive view than the kind from top down that, says everything is really good? So, for example, the Korean films, the Parasite and the Squid Games, which have been enormously popular around the world, have a very bleak view of class conflict in a place like Korea, but to some degree increase kind of global respect for Korea's, creativity and wrestling with its problems. Is that maybe a better approach than, a more top-down approach that says everything is really good in the system?
Yeah, I think having a certain kind of humility, but also space for self-critique, satire, humor about one's own system is a very productive form of engagement via kind of soft power, if you will, or public diplomacy, because it showcases that one has enough confidence to critique oneself. And I think that that's something that is often lacking in some of these very top-down, top constructed, soft power engagements, that there isn't that space for satire, humor, or self-confidence to say, well, it's okay if some of our initiatives are not doing that well, because that's not acceptable. When I asked some of my interviews in China about, incorporating more contemporary Chinese culture into, say, Confucius Institute's kind of programming, the response was often quite positive, that it's a good idea in theory, but how do you kind of do that? Because that's a pretty big, kind of idea, and what do you incorporate there? Because there could be all kinds of voices, all kinds of different ideas that might not be necessarily in line, again, with kind of the propaganda narratives. How do you contain that once it starts to open up? How do you kind of control for that? So the idea is kind of welcome, but how to implement it seems to be very challenging. And I do think that overall, having kind of some critique or some self-critical stance is often a very attractive feature of engagement. And I myself have watched Parasite and Squid Game and enjoyed the, these productions. But also thinking about the US, I think in US, say from a comparative perspective of US public diplomacy, there's been some rethinking as well about how to present a more wholesome story of the United States to external audiences. And some of my engagements with State Department officials, they were asking about how does one kind of showcase our own problems, right, without necessarily damaging our image, but talking about racial tensions here, all kinds of forms of inequality and discrimination, without necessarily saying everything in the United States is bad. But how do you kind of reckon with this, with the darker side of, our own kind of national image? And I think there is this kind of rethinking of how to present that in more fluid, but also more open way, having this kind of more humble, perhaps, presentation of what the US is about. And so maybe other great powers are also reckoning with similar questions, but because China is so much of a top-down constructed soft power system, it makes it harder for them to do so.
This could perhaps lead to a question from Sam Tsoi just now about overseas Chinese engagement with them, immigrants, students, business people, and so forth. Are they part of Chinese soft power strategy? And how might the rise of anti-Asian racism during COVID, for example, here in this country, affect, the way China approaches overseas Chinese and, how the soft power message comes out?
Yeah, that's a great question that fits into kind of the last slide I showed about the instruments, understudied instruments of soft power. I think Chinese diasporic communities, including especially students, are really important kind of public population, if you will, to study when it comes to Chinese soft power engagements, because they can be both kind of the delegates of soft power, but they can also potentially inhibit it depending on what their expressions are, how they engage with China's official messaging. But over a pretty extensive period of time, I think Chinese party state, including various bureaucrats, have been engaging actively with Chinese overseas students, sending delegations, sending all kinds of representatives to attract them to return to China, but also to continue to build relationships. Some, of course, in the sharp power kind of context, argue that this is more coercive than that. It's not just about relationship building. It's about kind of creating informers, co-opting and introducing this kind of informant system within American universities, and basically kind of facilitating a very unfree system, within an American academia. The fact that there are some students who maybe are concerned about how they appear vis-a-vis Chinese officials who might be monitoring them, as opposed to, how they appear vis-a-vis their professors in American universities or colleges. So I think there is kind of that, maybe again, kind of sharper side of the story, but overall the engagement has been very intensive in the media space when it comes to Sinophone media, Chinese language media outlets. There've been annual summits with editors and journalists taking place in Beijing, where they'll be invited to, visit China, engage with Chinese audiences and officials, and to kind of, be hopefully facilitating a much more pro-China line, and also getting funding investment from Chinese Communist Party. So there's material, enhancement. There's also kind of the cultural cooptation or engagement, if you will, and this kind of notion of building this ties to the mother nation. I think that that's been a really important part of arguably soft power, but also maybe larger kind of project of nation building in China. It's not just about soft power, it's also about the domestic legitimacy, right? So it's a really complex issue that I think we need to look at more closely. It's a really exciting topic for research.
And one final question about the United States, but then I'm going to go and talk a lot of questions are about Africa and other parts of the world, developing world. From Tom Gold, he asks about whether Trump's foreign bullying, MAGA and so forth, a lack of interest in the other world, created an opening for Chinese soft power. Are there kind of vulnerabilities in the way in which other countries, especially superpower like the USA, goes about its relationships, that allows China to present itself as a welcome contrast to it?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, we've seen this, especially in the context of the insurrection, January 6th insurrection, how quickly Chinese state media have jumped on the story and have been covering it, or were covering it at that moment, dissecting every element of the story and just portraying the US as kind of this very unstable democracy, very unstable, fractured, and China is a much more efficient, stable, kind of a more attractive, kind of democratic nation. That's how they often portray themselves as democracy, but also globally, right? But this kind of damage in relationship building, I think, has been made. And even though under Biden, there's this attempt to kind of quickly rebuild, America is back, but that damage is not forgotten. Like, I think there's a lot of cynicism about the United States foreign policy, again, in many parts of the global South, and this notion that the US is unstable, kind of a unpredictable nation, but also in many ways hypocritical when it comes to relationship building. Under one president, you have one kind of policy, under another, you have somewhat of a different side. How can you trust? How can you build long-term relationships? And of course, Trump is not necessarily kind of a figure that disappeared from the political space. He's still very active, and there's a lot of uncertainty about the next election cycle. So there's discussions about that. How stable, how long-term is this shift under Biden? So I do think it's caused an immense damage in the image of the United States, and I think that China has attempted to take advantage of that in many ways. So it's a really important question. Thank you.
Some of the questions deal with Africa and also Latin America too. Could you talk a little, just expand a little more on the work you've been doing on Chinese soft power and its influence in Africa, both positive and negative? And also, have you done looked at all about relationship with Latin America, which is also actually, I think they're being quite vigorous about that, and whether the approaches toward Latin America and other countries in the lesser developed countries are they similar or different?
Yeah, so that's a pretty big topic. So maybe I can come back for another talk one day when the next book
You'll have to, but
hopefully out. But just a few brief, I guess, notes about how I'm engaging with this topic. So in this other bigger book project, I engaged in this relationship of kind of soft power, affinity building, as I describe them as opportunistic solidarities, because a lot of these relationships are the way they're formed. They're based on opportunities, again, kind of material gains and all kinds of other opportunities that Chinese soft power offers, as opposed to a deeper cultural and personal connections that are being formed on the ground. So when it comes to anything that China is offering, whether it's trainings, Confucius Institutes, scholarships, media, we also see significant amount of variation in reception. That's something that I discuss a lot in this bigger book project, and quite a bit of contestation. Especially, I contrast the kind of the public-facing perceptions or reactions to Chinese soft power versus kind of more private or kind of hidden reactions, right? So the description here, for instance, when it comes to trainings, you see officials coming for trainings to China and praising China publicly, giving interviews to Chinese media, and basically playing into what Chinese officials want to hear. But when you interview them privately and ask about their perceptions of China and the trainings and their concerns about China's presence in their countries, there's a lot more critical, self-reflective commentary that comes out. So there's a lot of critiques about the trainings being perhaps too, again, top-down, kind of too much control from the top-down, not enough space to ask sensitive, complicated questions. When those questions are asked, there's kind of a silencing on the Chinese side or ignoring of difficult, contentious topics, but also lack of engagement with the more problematic, perhaps complex aspects of China's presence in their respective countries, whether it's environmental degradation or labor rights or other kind of issues that are more sensitive. There's often a challenge of having a conversation, open conversation with Chinese counterparts about that. So in many ways, we see this kind of contrast between public-facing kind of gratitude, rituals or engagements, but also the private critiques, reflections that are often unnoticed in public opinion polls. So that's something I try to write a lot about, in my work. And Ethiopia perhaps is one of the cases that is deemed to have a relatively fruitful platform or context for China's engagement in soft power. But even in that context, we see quite a bit of pushback, and the pushback is present across different societal layers, elites, students, the layman or general public that engages with Chinese products, that kind of critiques the quality of those products. So we see kind of the pushback in very creative and subtle ways on social media, but also in interviews and oral culture discussions and so forth. So I think that side I find very, very interesting. That's something that I try to engage in more detail, but also the motivations and the engagement, the Chinese side, why are they engaging in these initiatives? And oftentimes you see a big distinction between what the state official policy is about, teaching about Chinese culture, improving China's image, and the motivations of individuals who are basically involved in this project of soft power, oftentimes, again, going to Africa for pragmatic reasons of practicing the professional skills, learning to speak English more fluidly, or getting some professional or commercial opportunities. So oftentimes it's very specific, individualized kind of goals that are being pursued by those soft power representatives, if you will, as opposed to the grand strategy or the grand goals of improving China's image. Sometimes those goals are even set aside or even forgotten in their presence, during their presence in Africa. So I think that's what I'm kind of exploring. And I think that, of course, the research on Africa is a pretty wealth of research that's coming out across different contexts. It's a very complex continent. So I also don't want to claim that I'm speaking on behalf of all this work or on behalf of all the countries. I'm only empirically examining one country. So that's just something I want to put as a side note. There are other scholars looking at South Africa, at Kenya, at many other contexts, and they're all very different depending on their political system, colonial legacies, cultural context, and the extent of Chinese presence. And when it comes to Latin America, I haven't empirically examined that context, but I think that what I did observe that was interesting is that some of these tools and mechanisms of soft power that have initially been applied in Africa are now being widely applied across Latin America. And in some ways, at least according to some official reports, there's a bit of re-examining to what extent China wants to stay as active in Africa, or does it want to kind of balance out its presence and spend more resources on Latin America. I think there's kind of a bit of a shift happening at the moment. Of course, US has been so prominent in Latin America, but there's also so much cynicism and critique and pushback against the US and its soft power and its economic and military power in particular. So I think that's something that gives a chance maybe for some of these Chinese initiatives to have more resonance. It's a really exciting topic, I think, to explore more. And of course, again, Latin America, very complex, whole continent of so many different countries with so many different systems. We have to be mindful of overgeneralizing, China's performance there.
Okay, we're running short on time, and there's a huge amount of questions and a huge amount of comments back and forth in the chat. There's no way to really do justice to any of these. But here's maybe one other question near the end we can ask about the motivation and characteristics of the teachers and editors that China sends overseas to promote soft power. Are they enthusiastic about their work and motivated to mingle with the local community? Or are they bureaucrats who have no incentive to deliver more than what the job description says? So I suppose one thing that would make soft power more effective is if the agents of presenting the point of view are really enthusiastic and fully believe it, versus just doing a job and going through the motions. So what is your assessment of the people that are sent to these various places and about the kind of message they deliver?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it is important to distinguish between the individuals who are being sent and what they're actually there for, and what their motivations are, versus the motivations of the party state. That they're not always the same thing. And I think when it comes to motivations, it really varies, depends on where they're sent. So oftentimes the preference, despite all the fractures in US-China relations or China-Europe relations, there's still, I think, an emphasis or a motivation to get to the West when it comes to the hierarchies of one's positions. That's considered to be much more prestigious posting. And one gets to, again, internationalize their expertise, maybe enroll their kids into an American or a European university, kind of benefit more from that experience. So when it comes to that, I think there's kind of a desire to be posted in those spaces. When it comes to Global South, or Africa, Latin America, I know a little bit less about, but I think there is a bit more of a practical motivation that, at least from what I've observed, it's often kind of a testing ground for one's professional skills. So the journalists that are being sent to, say, Nairobi, the ones I've encountered are much younger than, less experienced than the ones that are being sent to Washington or to, Brussels or London. So they're kind of really fresh out of either school or out of their kind of professional experience within domestic media, and now they're out there doing international reporting. So in some ways, it makes them more curious and more maybe experimental or adventurous. In other ways, they're just less experienced in engaging with international publics or international work. So that kind of creates a bit of a friction. But when it comes to what they're there for, I think it varies. But my overall perception was that there's a lot of pragmatic rationale about why one is going abroad for these certain functions. It's kind of in some ways almost a survival. Like, I'm going to go there for a couple of years, then I'm going to go somewhere else, somewhere better, somewhere more advanced, somewhere more exciting, somewhere more beautiful. So there are all kinds of kind of hierarchies of postings. But overall, often the perception is much more kind of practical and narrow, or the engagement rather, as opposed to something very grand or motivated by big ambitions to change people's hearts and minds. I think that's something that I've observed through my work, and I'm happy to share also link, or later on to share the link to my study about Confucius Institutes that's just published, and that speaks directly to that question about the motivations of teachers.
Oh, great. Well, thank you very much. Look, we can go on for quite some time with all these questions and comments, but I think it's time, unfortunately, to kind of call this to a close. And let me say a few quick words about upcoming events that we have here at 21st Century China. There's going to be a talk on May 4th on the rise and fall of imperial China by Wang Yuhua from Harvard. And that will be a hybrid event. So it'll be both on campus here in person, but also live streamed and hybrid. Then day after that's at 4 p.m. on May 4th. And on May 5th at 5, another hybrid event by Victor C., who is our associate professor of political science here at the UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy, based on his new book on coalitions of the weak and coalition politics and governance in China. And then on May 19th at 1, there's another webinar about an alternative world order by Dawn Murphy, Associate Professor of International Security Studies at the U.S. Air War College. So a lot of exciting events coming up here. This was an exciting event today. we thank you very, very much, Maria, and look forward to reading more of your work and hearing about more of it in the near future.
Thank you so much, Professor Madsen, and thanks for hosting, taking the time to engage with my work, and I hope to be connected in the future.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Okay.